On behalf of faithandreason.org, my name is Bill McGarvey. I'd like to welcome my longtime friend, Father Jim Martin from American Magazine, to our Honest to God conversation. Welcome, Father Jim. Really good to be with you.
Good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Honest to God is an invitation to conversation. We really want to encourage people to think a bit more and feel a bit more about what it means to be a Christian in a coarsening and increasingly violent culture. To do that, we are asking people to think more deeply about who Jesus of Nazareth actually was, both a peacemaker and a troublemaker, the builder of an inclusive community, but also someone who called out powerful abusers. My first question then, Father Jim, is do you think inviting people to reflect in this fashion is even possible in the polarized environment we live in? Is it even a worthwhile endeavor?
Well, I think it is certainly a worthwhile endeavor since I have devoted, most of my adult life to that, as you know. I think that the character and the figure, the person of Jesus is uniquely appealing to people. And people might not like religion or the Catholic Church or Christian churches or whatever, or organized religion in general. But my sense is that Jesus is naturally appealing. And when people talk about Jesus, they get excited. When they read the Gospels, they get excited. He's challenging, as you said. He is a troublemaker, but he's also a healer and someone who wants unity. He's someone who also cannot be contained by any one religion or any one faith tradition. So he's always bigger than we think. But yeah, I think Jesus is always fascinating for people.
Well, then, how is it then that we're dealing with in a culture in which we have Christian people writing books about how empathy is a weakness of Christians, and how is that the case? I mean, where is this Jesus coming from?
Well, it's a Jesus of their own making. I'm reminded of Thomas Jefferson, who decided that he didn't like the miracles of the resurrection in the gospel story, so he scissored them out, literally, and he created his own Bible, basically. And, again, he's creating a Jesus of his own making, and this is what, a lot of people today are doing. The irony of saying that empathy is something bad, Jesus is described many times in the Gospels as having his heart moved with pity. It's actually, the Greek is in his guts. The Greek word is splanknon. And, this is what Jesus felt. And we're supposed to be like Jesus. We're not sons of God exactly, but like Jesus was. But we're supposed to pattern our lives after him. And so we're supposed to feel empathy and compassion. So people have always tried to fit Jesus into their own worldview and into their own little sort of box, basically. But again, he always escapes.
It's amazing to me. I think about it a lot when we talk about scripture and we talk about the Jesus story and about the Gospels, obviously, and the Christian story. I often wonder, when you read the Gospel and you learn about this life and the relatively short ministry life he had and in the life of his followers, how do people get from that story and the character, the person they meet in that story, to this very rigid and strict and unforgiving and unmerciful God that I think passes for Christianity in too many people's minds today? Any thoughts about that? Where that comes from? I mean, that comes from a deep need, maybe for certain structure. I'm kind of fascinated. It's almost as if people read Catcher in the Rye and say, "Oh, this is a handbook for how to deal with juvenile delinquency," and they don't get the story. They don't meet Holden Caulfield.
Well, I think because it's difficult, right? It's a lot easier to say, I'm going to judge people and say I'm sinless and these other people are sinful. Oftentimes in these situations, it's us versus them, which is the direct opposite of what Jesus is doing. Now, Jesus does call out sinful behaviors, but he also says, God's the judge, or he's the judge, right? Not other people. And he says pretty specifically, judge not, lest you be judged, right? It's pretty obvious. But that's hard for people. It's hard for people not to judge. People can be selfish. I can be selfish too. I can be judgmental too at times. And to really follow what Jesus is asking us to do, which is to create an us, is difficult. So people take the easy path and they say, I'm right and everybody else is wrong. And where Jesus challenges me, for example, to take care of the poor, to reach out to people in the margins, but I don't need to listen to that. That's not as important. Mm-hmm. I think I always go back to something that Father Richard Rohr said. I think probably the Richard Rohr quote that I use the most, and I recently just interviewed him for a podcast that I have. Richard said, Jesus never said, worship me. He said, follow me. And I think, look, I worship Jesus. I go to mass. I, adore the Blessed Sacrament, all those kinds of things in the Catholic tradition. But he's right. Richard's right. Jesus says, follow me. Right. And I think people tend to just say, all I need to do is say, oh, Jesus is my savior. And I don't have to worry about the hard stuff like helping the poor or caring for people who are strangers because it's tough. So I think people let themselves off the hook that way.
That's really interesting. You mentioned that quote from Richard Rohr because D.L. Dykes, who is the Methodist minister that he's been passed away in the 1990s, but he is sort of the minister that, the foundation was named after. His quote that when I started working with the foundation was, Jesus never asked us to worship him. He asked us to be like him. And
Yeah.
it's a very powerful quote. And in terms of you've been dealing with going to Rome a little more frequently over the past few years, dealing with the communications dicastery over there, and also the synod process. You met with Pope Francis numerous times, and I know you've already met with Pope Leo. And my question is, how would you say maybe the church has become more honest? The Roman Catholic Church has become more honest to God, so to speak, in the Francis papacy or the Leo papacy, not in the sense of it being deceitful necessarily before, but in the terms of how has that grown or changed?
That's interesting. I want to make sure I understand your question. What do you mean by being more honest? Do you mean more transparent or?
I think for a lot of people that aren't Catholic that'll be watching this, I think it's hard not to see that there wasn't a tonal shift for a lot of people in Pope Francis. You just see it in the way they light up when you mention Pope Francis. To my Jewish friends, to my friends on many levels, they go like, oh yeah, they just have. They just identify with him in ways, even if they don't have any faith life of their own. They don't know Pope Leo as much, but I think I've often had people come up and say, do you think Pope Leo is going to be like Pope Francis? So there's something viscerally there. I'd like you to see if you can comment on it, why that is.
I think that's accurate. I think it's just people responding to a different kind of personality, right? Because not everybody liked Pope Francis, particularly in the United States and, in parts of Italy, especially. I liked him a lot. I think he was a very holy guy. But, he was different than St. John Paul II, Benedict XVI. He just was. He was different kind of person. More, and this is not to denigrate them at all, I think more spontaneous, right? I tend to look, I think this is unfair, but I tend to look at least John Paul's writings more as kind of a philosopher, Benedict a theologian. Francis more of a pastor. It's a very reductionist thing because they're all philosophers, theologians, and pastors. But people respond to different personalities. Now, Francis was, as a Jesuit, also very free of a lot of things that could have burdened him. So he didn't really care where he lived. He didn't care about, as he called it, making a mess. Right, by some of his statements. Now, I think a lot of people find that Pope Leo is a little more moderate and cautious, and they like that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's just people responding to a personality. I thought he was great, and I think that the church needed someone to kind of shake it up a little bit, and he certainly did. And one-on-one, he was a lot of fun. I never met John Paul or Benedict, so they may have been tons of fun too, but Francis was a lot of fun, and I think people could tell that, just by looking at him.
What does that mean? I got to ask, what does it mean? He was a lot of fun one-on-one. Can you give me an example?
Yeah, he was funny. He was funny and relaxed. I'll tell you a story. So I work, as you know, with a lot of LGBTQ Catholics. That's part of my ministry these days. And the first time I saw him in 2019, I think, I thought it would be the first and last time I saw him. And so I, was asking him all these different questions. And at one point I said, how do you suggest I deal with cardinals and bishops and priests who are, kind of attacking me? And I expected some long theological answer like, I don't know, Christ suffered too, or I don't know, something like that. And he just waved his hand just like this. He said, "Oh, there's Pharisees everywhere." So, this is very blunt and freeing. And nothing, we shouldn't stereotype all Pharisees and we shouldn't stereotype Judaism in Jesus' time. I know that. But I think his point was basically, don't worry about it. Yeah. I had a lot of experiences where it was fun to be with him. He was just very lighthearted. The first time I met him, again, that same meeting, I was told that when you go in, you should ask him because he invites you to the audience, right?
Hmm.
You should ask him, what would you like to talk about? That's the correct thing to say.
Okay.
So I said, what would you like to talk about? And he said, what would you like to talk about? So yeah, just really great. And I see in Pope Leo that same kind of friendliness
Hmm.
and openness.
Well, and Pope Leo brings up an interesting because though for those who don't follow this, Pope Leo took the name Pope Leo, most likely in some sort of recognition of Pope Leo from the late 19th century, who was the author of Rerum Novarum, which is a landmark encyclical on labor and the rights of labor and the economy. Basically, the church. It really is sort of the ground the sort of solid ground of Catholic social teaching, I would guess, is the best way to put it. And yet in America, I have to say, speaking about some of the resistance that you've found in America, there is sort of a sense the middle has shifted significantly rightward in recent decades. Far more Catholics, kind of explicitly identifying as economic and not just cultural conservatives, which really runs kind of it resists a bit of what Rerum Novarum and what certainly the church's was Catholic social teaching would teach. Can you talk a little bit about how Rome might work on that or help with that, and what that means going forward?
I think that's an accurate analysis. I think that the church in the United States, has moved rightward, more traditionalist, more conservative, although those are political labels, but we all know what we're talking about. Rome understands that, i.e., the Vatican understands that. But Pope Leo has been very clear about, as you said to begin with, taking the name Leo in honor of Leo the 13th. And that's a very good description of who he was. I would say father of modern Catholic social teaching, certainly on the right, on the side of laborers and workers and the poor. And, Leo talked about the AI revolution as being comparable in a sense to the Industrial Revolution that Leo the 13th was going through. But he's been pretty clear, about what he thinks is important. For example, helping migrants and refugees, focusing on the poor. He's been crystal clear on that. So we will see if people who resisted Francis on that are any more amenable to hearing Leo because he's an American. I remember right after he was elected, I was in Rome at the time for the conclave, as you know. One of the things that dawned on me as soon as he came out of the balcony was, well, people in the United States will not be able to say, like they said of Francis, he doesn't understand the United States. One of the things I remember from the conclave, which I was over in Rome for, as you remember, was that afterwards, one of the cardinals who had participated in the conclave, without breaking confidences, said to me, we were electing a pope for the world, not just for the church. Right. And so someone who's a world figure, but also we elected someone who had a missionary heart and who was close to the poor. And that's not always the case with, some Catholics and particularly Catholic commentators. Leo was on the side of the poor, as was Jesus, as was Francis, as was Benedict, as was John Paul, as was Paul VI, all the way back to Jesus. So
Right.
we have to remember that.
I mean, it is sort of interesting because it again, to talk about how the story resonates so differently when I deal with with folks who push back all the time, basically in terms of the church shouldn't be talking about economic issues. The church shouldn't be talking about, just stay in their lane. How do you deal with that?
Well, one thing people tell me you don't know much about economics. I remind them I went to Wharton and I worked for GE for 6 years, so I know a little bit. I'm not a complete fool when it comes to that. But also the key is basically preaching the gospel. And if the gospel has political implications, then so be it. Jesus is very clear about caring for those who are poor and sick and strangers. That means migrants and refugees, the homeless. He just couldn't be clear about that. And so if that has a political sort of result, then so be it. On top of that, the tradition of Catholic social teaching is part of Catholic teaching, right? I mean, these are encyclicals. It's the highest, it's almost the highest level of authority in the church, right? And so, the epithet Catholic, cafeteria Catholic, which is often applied to people on the left, right, can also be applied to people on the right. You can't just pick and choose. Or if you do pick and choose, you have to say that I'm going against Catholic social teaching. So it's just part of who we are. And look, more basically, as you know, Bill, Jesus said, care for the poor, right? Matthew 25, the litmus test for entrance into the kingdom of heaven or the reign of God or heaven is, how well did you care for the least of my brothers and sisters? Couldn't be clearer.
Right. That's a great point. And sort of my next question is, I know you've done a lot of work with LGBTQ folks. Your book, Building a Bridge, got a lot of attention and also a lot of I know resistance in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And I know and from many who really took issue with your outreach to LGBTQ folks. Can you talk a little bit about? Can you foresee a time when issues around sexuality are not as central? And I feel like oftentimes we obsess about what was the line by the Reverend Jim Wallace, who said in seminary, they looked it up, that, in scripture, sex is mentioned or homosexuality was mentioned X amount of times, whereas, the poor were mentioned 3,000 times. It was like,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
you count one on one hand, and like you tell me where God's head is at, where God's mind is at. There's a sense, I think, that some of the bishops in the U.S. and the church is preoccupied sometimes with issues of sexuality and all this sort of. Do you see a time when that might change, and if this preoccupation in the church and how that'll affect younger people's interest or relevance to the church? Can you talk a little bit about that in your work over the past few years?
Yeah. I mean, I think, the church's teaching on sexuality is fundamentally, about reverence, right, for the other person, which is, beautiful and is something that people need to hear, in an era of like hookups, right, things like that. But it is true. I mean, this sort of overemphasis on homosexuality really does strike some people as odd, given that Jesus never talked about it. St. Paul mentions it briefly, and in fact, the translation, we have to kind of question what he was talking about. The Old Testament talks about it, and people, say, well, the Old Testament condemns it. The Old Testament also says women should be stoned for adultery, right? And people should be stoned for taking the name of the Lord in vain. We don't do that anymore. I sometimes say to people, well, that's in the Bible. Why shouldn't we do that? Well, that's different. We think about it differently. But homosexuality, sometimes we suddenly become literalist and fundamentalist. I think it's changing in some places. You have more and more parishes and dioceses that are offering outreach programs to LGBTQ Catholics. Not everywhere, but it's changing. It's happening. Mm-hmm. A huge step forward was Pope Francis. Pope Francis did more for LGBTQ people than all of his predecessors combined. He's the first pope ever to use the word gay in public. He had appointed an openly gay man to a papal commission. He met with transgender people. He met with people like myself and Sister Janine Gramick from New Ways Ministry and all sorts of other people who work with LGBTQ people. More importantly, he called for the decriminalization of homosexuality. And that's a big step forward. I think what's important to say, and I'm obviously speaking to a largely English-speaking audience and maybe mostly in the U.S. and in the West, stuff that we think is sort of small potatoes is a big deal overseas. Mm-hmm. And I often say to people, calling for the decriminalization of homosexuality, meeting with transgender people, using the word gay. Some people in the West say, big deal, and sort of lukewarm. What's lukewarm over here is really white hot in other places. What's lukewarm in New York is white hot in Nairobi. Right. And so we have to remember that he took a big chance. And then in addition to that, what's happening is as more and more people are coming out, more and more priests are affected, more and more parishes are affected. Bishops have nieces and nephews who are gay, right? It just changes things. Not everywhere. I mean, still sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe, very difficult for LGBTQ Catholics. But it's changing slowly, and I hope it continues to change, and I hope people continue to listen to LGBT people.
Have you seen that anecdotally in your own experience in your work?
You mean in the Vatican?
In the Vatican, or just any of your experience? I mean, I know you get a lot of resistance about that issue, but I'm just thinking, how did that come home to you when you said, "Whoa, this is clearly of a different magnitude in other cultures"? At the synod, I participated in the synod of bishops, and I was there for 2 sessions in 2023 and 2024. And some of the stuff you heard coming out of people's mouths was really shocking. I mean, it was really hateful. Not everybody. I would say most of the people there were very open to the question. I had one synod delegate refuse to sit next to me at the table. Mm.
He just refused to sit next to me, because of my ministry with LGBTQ people. And I said to someone at the time, even if you think I'm a sinner, you're supposed to sit with me. That's what Jesus said, right? So you're supposed to eat with and sit with sinners. Yeah, I mean, it's so cultural for some places. Sub-Saharan Africa it's pretty tough to be gay. A lot of
That person who wouldn't sit with you was from that part. That
he was not. He was from the Middle East.
Okay.
And Eastern Europe, it's very difficult.
Mhm.
What I saw changing was, and I know this for a fact, at the Synod, we got reports from different bishops' conferences. So the conferences, say, for the U.S. Catholic Conference of Catholic Bishops, the French bishops, this bishop conference, fully half of them mention LGBTQ people, and not just in the West, including in Africa. So it's something that's bubbling up, and we talked about it at the Synod. It was difficult, and the conversation could be kind of explosive, but we talked about it. And so that's a big step forward. I mean, that would not have happened 10 years ago. And that's all thanks to Francis, and also more and more people coming out. So it really is a flashpoint for a lot of people. And it was really difficult for people to talk about. But there was also a desire among most people to say, how do we move forward on this? I think most people recognize there are LGBTQ people in their dioceses if they're bishops, or parishes if they're priests, or communities if they're lay people, right, and their parishes and schools, and they want to know, how do we move forward? So that was the overall sort of approach. What do we do with this?
I know, Jim, you in addition to your writing on issues like that and in work in communications, you do a lot of work in terms of prayer and the exercises and a lot of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And I guess I'd like to ask you, just in closing, maybe for a spiritual practice you would recommend for people who are struggling in terms of the world, in terms of the questions we were talking about here in Honest to God, about faith, reason, or relevance in a time of such division, a time of real pain and change, and people are searching for hope. Any spiritual practice you would recommend for people reviewing this?
Yeah, I would say three things. First of all, if you're a Christian, or even if you're not, read the Gospels. Encounter Jesus through the Gospels. It helps to have a Bible commentary, but you don't have to have a PhD to read the Gospels if you really want to know who Jesus was. That's the first thing. The second thing is a practice that we Jesuits have. It starts the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, who was the founder of the Jesuits. It's called the presupposition. And it means always giving people the benefit of the doubt. It's very helpful. It's hard, right? Assume that they are coming from a good place, that they want the best, that you want the best for them. It makes conversations easier. And then the third thing I would say is a very simple prayer practice called the examination of conscience, where you just review your day, and usually at the end of the day for 10, 15 minutes, and just see where you encounter God. For people who are struggling and despairing even, over what's going on in our country and in the world, seeing where God is present to you and seeing where God has touched you or where you've been consoled, it can be very helpful, because you can go through the day and say, oh, that was terrible. And then when you sit down and you look back, you say, oh, I forgot about that, right? That was actually a really nice moment. Thank you, God. So it can really ground you in the spiritual life. So I'd say first, read the Gospels. Second, give people the benefit of the doubt. And third, try the examination of conscience.
I'm a big fan of the Examen. I went to Jesuit schools, as you know, and the Examen is definitely something a part of my life as well. And it does help you sort of go through, even a practical way to just kind of go through and say, what happened today?
Yeah.
See it through a different lens. So, and of course, the fourth one should be, they should also check out the Spiritual Life podcast. And what else should we promote here while we have you?
Well, while you're here, I have a new book coming out called Work in Progress, which is a memoir about actually finding God in the secular world, this time in the 1970s and 1980s. I think people will like it. Work in Progress by Harper One.
Great. Father Jim Martin, honest to God, I want to thank you for everything, for your friendship and for your wisdom here and your time, and all the best.
My pleasure, and good luck with this project.